people can enter the webinar, so please bear with us. Thank you for your patience. It takes a while for people to filter in. You can hear my cat snoring. God, she's loud. This is what happens when you have an old cat. Okay, as people filter in, I want to, before we formally start the webinar, I want to thank our sponsors, including the Foreign Policy Association of the United States, the Internet Society of Washington, D.C., the Center for International Governance Innovation, GW's Institute for International Economic Policy, and Institute of Science and Technology Policy, and everybody else who's helped us with this webinar and many others. So good morning, and we're going to start now. So I'm going to begin by introducing our speakers, who not only come from 3 different countries, but also have 3 different types of training and experience dealing with issues of AI. So at the bottom of my screen is Niraj Bhargava from Canada, who is a serial entrepreneur and an engineer. We have Reema Patel from the United Kingdom, who is trained in philosophy and who came up with the idea for the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is a UK NGO and think tank that works on AI issues as well as data issues. And finally, we have Melissa Flagg, who is a PhD chemist, who has also worked at the US Department of Defense and is now a professor at Georgetown University, a very prestigious institution in Washington, D.C. So welcome, everybody. And so I'm going to begin with some questions for a moderated discussion, and then we open the floor up to your questions, and I see we already have one, so we'll try to get started with that as soon as we can. Okay, so thank you so much. So first, let me ask you guys, is AI a global public good? And if so, what should governments be doing to advance AI? So Reema, do you want to start?
Yes, so I think the answer is, so firstly, what is AI? And taken very briefly, I like to think of AI as a data-driven technology. So data about and relating to us used in different ways. It's a really broad definition, used in different ways, and to develop particular technologies that allow us to secure certain types of outcomes. And so, I mean, starting with that definition, there is this really important question, which is, what is the AI being used for? And so I think my answer, very briefly, is it can be a public good, but of course that depends on taking a step back and thinking, what is it being used to do and being deployed to do, which raises a really important set of ethical questions, because AI is being deployed in all sorts of different ways, some ways that are highly politically contentious, and in other ways that are incredibly socially beneficial and useful. Take the example of the use of AI to develop diagnostic tools that we would take years, decades to do so. So almost the answer is it can be, but not necessarily always, and that means that we need to have a conversation about how we make it a public good.
Thank you. Melissa?
I'd just like to add that I do think it's really important for people to really wrap their heads around the fact that AI is not a thing. It is not a widget. It is math, right? It's learning. It's defined in a million different ways by a million different people. You have an AI industrial sector. You have people funding research in AI, but you also have a tremendous sector of industries like manufacturing, transportation, healthcare, finance, that are leveraging, in many cases, very basic approaches to machine learning, which we would never have called AI in the past, but now we call AI. And they're simply making essentially the exact same processes they were doing before more efficient. They're able to look at patterns more effectively. So I think it's really important to distinguish this idea of very narrow artificial intelligence, which we used to just call machine learning, and this concept very far in the future of general artificial intelligence, which quite frankly is not close to the horizon. So the conversations are critical, but it's really important not to conflate the science fiction with what we're actually doing today and who is actually doing it.
Niraj?
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here and build on Reema and Melissa's comments. I think technology has been a tool forever in our society, but certainly with AI, we have this opportunity to build intelligence and learning in our technology. And there's some significant problems in our world. Many are for public good that AI can be applied to. And as said, there are specific questions, whether it's in poverty reduction, in health, in climate change. I've been involved in smart grid technologies where we can now connect supply and demand for energy uses using artificial intelligence, so we can optimize how much power we need to build. So there certainly is public good opportunities in solving big problems with AI, but as pointed out, there are needs, as we'll talk about, for guardrails and for making sure we do it ethically, and there's also opportunity for AI to be used in other ways as well, but certainly is an opportunity.
Thank you. Why is trust in AI so important?
If I may come in on that, I think it's important for several reasons, but one is that when we're looking at AI and the types of technologies that it relates to, that relationship with data is again really crucial to spell out, which is that data is of and about and relates to people and society. So when you're looking at AI, you're not just looking at a technology, you're looking at a technology that is derived from making assumptions about people, using data about behavior to then affect outcomes that again are not just simply technological outcomes, they're about societal outcomes. So that's a really important reason for why trust is important, because it's actually at the heart of what it means for the technologies to be valid and useful. And indeed, you can make an argument about any technology really in that way, but with AI and data in particular, that's why it's really important. The other thing is that there's this point about we're having a conversation about things like digital contact tracing internationally, and unless one opts for a vision of a world in which adoption of certain technologies are mandatory, it's a vision of a world in which people need to feel that it works for them. And so, what it means for a technology to work for people in society is that it also has legitimacy and people feel that that technology is trusted and is trustworthy.
Yeah, please, Melissa.
I totally agree with everything Reema said. I think there's also this perspective, if you're thinking about it from government institutions, that if people feel like AI is actually driving the direction of decision making and they're not transparent about the underlying data for whatever reason, be it privacy or it's just simply that the data has become proprietary because a contractor is actually doing the work, or many other reasons, it's very hard to see where the bias is in the data. There will always be bias because the world is biased. Bias isn't necessarily a problem if you name it, if you can clearly articulate where the bias is, and you can clearly show how that might affect the decision-making process. But I think one of the biggest challenges that we have in democratic societies is that if people lose faith in the fact that people aren't actually making the decisions, but they're being driven down this path by AI, it will actually erode even further the trust people have in the institutions themselves. It's not just about trusting the AI, it's actually being conferred as trust to the institution as well. And I think specifically I'll just throw in one specific perspective, I think, from the Department of Defense, it's also that we feel very strongly in the national security community that people are accountable for their actions. And so as we go towards this path of AI being a part of the systems that people use in very high stress situations, do the operators trust the AI enough that they are willing to be held accountable for the actions that are no longer something where they can completely see how the decisions and recommendations are being made? I'm actually really heartened by this conversation in the Department of Defense, because that's why they've put out AI principles. That's why Mark Lewis, who's over in research and engineering in OSD, just put out a drive towards standards for AI so that they can assess all AI programs against standards. There is a real concern, I think, in democratic societies, more than they are given credit for, that their operators want to be able to trust these systems as much as society wants them to be able to trust these systems. And so I think trust becomes such a fundamental part of this conversation in so many ways.
Niraj, can you
Yeah, those
comment?
are great comments. I'd like to build on those. Trust is obviously a very big word, and in the human world, before I get to the machine world, I mean, we talk about reliability, credibility, integrity, and intimacy. You know, are the people in it for your personal interests as well? So we've been dealing and struggling with trust in humankind for millennia and centuries. So we have lots of checks and balances. We have our legal system, we have reference checks, we have audit systems, we have research, and many topics on human trust. Now, in the last number of years, a few years, we really have had a boom in machines that are intelligent, and we're building not just technology as a tool, but again, technology with intelligence and the ability to learn and make decisions. So we really need to think about how we measure and manage trust of the machines, not just humans. And many of the lessons learned in the human world can be applied to machines, but there's maybe an opportunity to actually even do it better, because we actually can purposely think about how we're programming. So when we program AI, we program with a purpose. We can talk about the people that are developing the AI and how we manage that activity. But importantly, with AI, we need to consider the guardrails and measurements of trustworthiness over time as well. Because with machine learning and AI, there's an opportunity to continue to learn and drift and shift. And so, so I would certainly advocate, as said by my colleagues, that the trust is a very important word for machines and for AI. But what I would also add is that we need to measure it. We need to do it transparently. We need to have some transparent measures so we can monitor what we're doing and have those guardrails so that we can feel confident and trust that these machines are going to be there for us, and we can keep an eye and monitor that, just like we would with humans. But with machines, there's different topics to measure. You know, some of the same, you know, bias, as Melissa mentioned, where there's humans bias, there's the machines bias. But the good news with machines is we can measure it. And so maybe there's a certain amount of bias that's acceptable. But as we know, if the training data is for one kind of population, perhaps urban population of certain ethnic groups, and then we apply that learning to a different population, we may have biases that we can measure and monitor. So bias, privacy, ethics, and explainability and transparency, because we also know in AI, sometimes you get higher performance with these black boxes, these deep neural nets, and in many cases that may be acceptable, but in other cases we may need explainable models. So building trust is to have that transparent measures that would allow us to build our confidence over time for AI.
I'd love to just one little dot on that, Susan, if you don't mind, is this idea of it not being static is really critical. It is very much like a human trust in that it's quite easy to lose trust in someone if they do something that you don't understand and they can't explain it to you. So this idea of explainability and the dynamism of this, the idea that maybe you certify a system on a regular basis, much like you would a pilot or a driver, as opposed to just saying, we trust you, and that's it for the rest of the machine's living life as it begins to learn, right, and changes. So I just couldn't agree more. And I think there are some really great conversations happening around this right now, and some incredible research in these areas as well.
Reema, do you want to add something?
Well, I was just really interested because, of course, there is a sense in which public confidence is important, and we need to realise the conditions that enable public confidence. But a lot of philosophers and thinkers have argued that actually trust is not the end goal. So it's the trustworthiness of the system that's really the important thing. And that so Honora O'Neill argues this essentially. She said that if someone doesn't trust something, then actually that's not about the individual's lack of trust. It's actually about the system. So in some instances, you may be perfectly right or legitimate to not trust something, but then the important question there is, what are the conditions that enable that thing or that interaction of that thing with the wider ecosystem to build that public confidence, rather than whether the trust is or is not there. I'm hoping I've explained that accurately or concisely, but essentially the point is, trust is a bit like a reservoir. It tells us something about what's going on, but it isn't the actual problem.
Well, okay, so in this discussion, we've moved from explaining AI to, and what we need to do if we want to see more equitable and, well, we didn't talk about equity, we indirectly mentioned it, but more trustworthy and ethical is what I meant to say, AI. But one thing that I think we didn't mention is, do people need to know? I mean, when firms or governments use AI to make decisions that have consequences for individuals, automation's been with us for more than 100 years. But do we need, is an important governance tool, although, Niraj, you talked about transparency, is an important governance tool simply to know that AI is being used in decision making?
Yeah, I think it comes back to your point of governance. We depend on good governance in all our organizations, government included, private sector, small company, large company. And so the governance principles absolutely apply to machines as they apply to humans. So we have lots of governance practices around how we have audits, we have board questions, we have many checks and balances in our good governance. We've learned a few lessons over the years on good governance, and we need to apply those, but they apply to machines as well. So I think we do need to make sure that our governance bodies do have visibility to the machines as well as the humans. And risk registers is an example on boards. If there is risks that the machines could be off kilter, we have a fiduciary responsibility as board members to ask the right questions and monitor that as well. So I certainly encourage that we make sure that all the governing bodies are paying attention to the machines and technologies within their organization.
Thank you. Reema, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I'll keep it brief. I mean, I think the kind of key thing here is that with certain types of decisions, they're so high impact that regardless of what system it was that was doing the processing, the decision making, even the advising, I would want to know, as a layperson, I want to know the steps that process went through. So, if you're going to be using an algorithm to make a decision about whether somebody should be taken into care or not, children's social care, then actually this isn't just about the algorithm, this is just about the way public service decision making is made. And what the really important issue is making sure that the use of AI and deployment of AI isn't introducing opacity in a system that a lot of people find really difficult to engage with anyway. So I think that's really important, and so I think that it's about kind of working back from the principles of what do we want to see in a democratic society, especially when decisions are being made in high impact areas, and then what would a layperson expect in terms of being able to understand how a decision is being made about such an important part of their life, And certainly, yes, I'd expect the same levels of transparency about an AI and automated system as I'd expect of any system at all in that space.
Melissa, did you want to add anything?
I mean, I feel like, again, this is, I really like what Niraj was saying about the fact that we've learned a lot of these governance. We know what good governance looks like. It doesn't mean that every country and every institution in every country abides by the highest standards of excellent governance all the time, 100% of the time. We're humans, and no nation can say they have or do. On the flip side, we've learned a lot about good governance, and transparency is a very challenging thing to sustain over time. You have to make decisions at speed, and you can't have a public discussion about every single decision that you'll make, or you'll never take an action. On the flip side, I agree completely with Reema that you should have those sort of ways that these decisions are made be public and be a part of an ongoing and open public debate. And to me, this is why we have civil society. This is why we actually have the media. We have open dialogues that are going on all the time that are pushing our institutions to be better. To me, this is just people need to take responsibility to be a proactive, civil, intellectual, caring part of that conversation, rather than just screaming at one another about somebody's the enemy. And if we have those conversations, we can generally elevate the quality of our governance.
Okay, well, I'm sorry. So we build this as looking at governance approaches. So the last question to you all is, what, Reema, you're gonna look at the EU, Melissa, you'll look at the US, Niraj, you'll talk about Canada and any other country where you've operated. What government is doing this right? And I don't just mean ethics in terms of stimulating research, encouraging people with AI expertise through incentives, through immigration. What government's doing it right? Melissa, why don't you begin?
Well, I mean, I think doing it right isn't how I would frame.
It's not a snapshot, but
and it's also
what government is moving in the right direction. Thanks for that.
No, but I also would just say this is an emerging enabling technology. It's not a widget. We're not building square pieces of metal, right? We are fundamentally pushing forward a new way of enabling almost every sector in the world. I mean, that's people are thinking about, how can I apply learning to almost every sector that exists. So I don't think this is a government thing. Governments set the environment that can make this better or worse. So I would just say, first of all, only 25% of R&D in the United States is funded by the federal government. 75% of research and development is funded outside the government. So one of the things that I think the US does well is they do have a strategy for AI for the future of industry. They're engaging, I think, very proactively with industry. I think that the National Institutes for Standards and Technology have spent an incredible amount of time trying to lean in to make sure that we have to actually have standards for artificial intelligence as it develops, and they're working extremely closely with allies and sort of non-traditional, not so straightforward allies. I think we have to also recognize that in this space, we are going to compete with our friends, and we're going to have moments where we need to collaborate with people who we're not so comfortable collaborating with. The US and China should be having conversations on AI safety. The US and Australia may be competing for the same talent in the mining sector for how we're going to apply AI to that. So I think that it's complicated enough that I can see beautiful things that each one of these countries are doing. The European Union has really pushed forward on privacy. The US has, I think, really pushed forward on standards. I think Canada is doing some incredible work in actually applying AI into the industrial sector, into really modernizing their immigration more than any of us. So I guess I wouldn't say there's one country that's got it right. I would say isolation from the world in a moment where this technology is pushing forward, and the global research and development investment is over 2.4 trillion, which is the US and China make up only 50% of that, seems like not the best path to being the most vibrant innovation sort of center in the world.
Reema?
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on that, I guess you mentioned the EU and approaches to privacy, and the GDPR is, people forget, quite a young piece of legislation, but the GDPR is a piece of legislation that applies across Europe to all member states, that provides for the protection of individual data. It does allow for data processing for AI purposes, but it means that people have certain rights that they can access in order to be able to, in order to, for their rights to be safeguarded. So around privacy, they have rights around being able to access the data for their own use, so to know how it's being used, and then rights particularly around consent, and a provision around legitimate use. So essentially public bodies that process data have to demonstrate that it's met certain criteria and standards. I'm not going to go into too much detail, except for to say that it's widely being regarded as a beneficial development, and has been quite interesting in terms of fostering a focus on privacy enhancing technologies within Europe. So in Netherlands and in other parts of Europe, a lot of approaches to data sharing have really been thinking about how to develop AI systems or tools that are privacy enhancing. So that's been quite interesting through our research. And again, it's not been around for that long, 2 years, so there's still more that we can learn off the back of that. Beyond the regulation, though, I think there's something really important about investment in skills and the strategic approach that the Commission is taking. So earlier this year, it published 2 papers. One is an AI white paper, and the other is a paper on the EU's data strategy, in which it sort of set out a vision for, well, essentially it set out a vision for how you might be able to build the infrastructure that enables value to come from data. So important things like skills, important things like the legal framework, but also the idea of enabling flows of data across European member states. So a vision for something called data spaces that enable the creation of data hubs or data spaces across member states in the areas of environment, finance, and health. And there's some interesting approaches across different countries. So France has got something which is called a health data hub. We've been in the UK, we've got a model around health data called the Biobank, which again is a kind of data altruism model. So people opt in to share data about themselves. It's got some kind of important boundaries around it, but that allows for its use for social, academic and research and clinical purposes. So a fair bit going on in Europe. Certainly there's a lot more to do, I think. I don't think it's perfect. I think there's more to build on. So I wouldn't say that Europe's got it right as such, but I think we're working on it.
Okay, I'm gonna start the questions since we have quite a few. So our first question is, with regard to government and skill sets, is there a need for directors, policymakers, and procurement officials to be better educated on AI?
I'll jump in. I mean, I think that there's actually a really significant effort underway in most parts of the world on this. I think everyone agrees that they definitely need to be more educated on it. I think the question is, do you actually need to understand the math, or do you need to be able to understand the larger concepts? And I think there's a little bit of variation about if you're at a programmatic agency that's making things, or that is funding actual research, you probably need a different type of understanding of AI, the people who are leading those agencies, than say if you're looking at regulatory environments. But I think the key is having access to people who are transparent, as to who you're talking to and hearing from, who do truly understand this and can articulate both their own perspective, but also the counter perspectives that exist.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Niraj.
Yeah, I agree that education and training is really important and valuable in AI and in the governance of AI. I think as an engineer, there is definitely some technical detail that is daunting to many of us because there's so much richness and depth required on really deeply understanding the technology. But I would certainly suggest that you don't need to be an expert from a technical point of view to be very able to apply AI effectively, govern it, make sure the outcomes are in the right direction. And so certainly there is room for education, but I also would say you don't need to become a technical expert or be daunted by some of these new technical terms. We're all learning the language, which is important, but it's really understanding the applications and the outcomes and the governance. I think is a key education requirement.
There is a free course that anyone can take that's sponsored by the government of Finland called Elements of AI. And if you want to know more, just plug it in on Google or email me. Could you elaborate on whether or not, excuse me, I need to rephrase this question. I'm a little confused by it. So let me skip to another one. What can governments do to mitigate human rights abuses through the misuse of AI? Anyone want to take that?
Can you
maybe?
Yeah.
I didn't quite catch it.
What governments do that is effective to mitigate human rights abuse through misuse of AI?
I mean, I think it's really challenging in two directions, right? I mean, on the one hand, this gives people, I think some groups who are trying to forward human rights in certain situations a way of actually exposing larger patterns of other governments. I think on the other hand, we have to be very careful about governments being able to root out sort of any voice that dissents by using these technologies that can essentially begin to track and trace and maybe fingerprint people. I think from a democratic society standpoint, we should in fact be thinking a lot more about novel encryption. We should be thinking a lot about data transparency. And I think instead of racing to the bottom in adversarial sort of frames or in a race to win by having the most AI, we should be coming together as like-minded nations to talk about how do we actually further these technologies through the lens of ensuring that potentially marginalized and or marginalized communities are taken care of, and that they can actually see enough of the data and enough of the technology to protest when appropriate and to keep themselves hidden as they see fit through encryption and other technologies.
Maybe I'll add, we had some great comments I'm learning about from Europe and US, and as a Canadian, I'll speak a little bit about the Canadian government as well. I think all governments are moving in areas of legislation and standards and support. In Canada, there's a lot of good work being done in research and education and immigration, but also by leading by example. And to this point about human rights, you may be aware, but the Treasury Board of the Government of Canada has a directive that leads by example, that all algorithms and automated decision-making within the government has to go through an algorithm impact assessment screen. And there's a questionnaire, and it's public and transparent. And so depending on the impact levels, we then have different mitigations that must be undertaken. So this is an instrument that the government has that allows these to be uncovered where there are impact that matters to the government, and that way within the government is there is transparency and understanding that we need to, especially in citizen-facing AI that's going on in the government. But what's interesting is that in the private sector of Canada, while legislation is always lagging, there's a lot of people saying, well, if the government's doing it, maybe we should as well. And so leading by example is something that I think we're doing well in Canada. Like all countries are learning, and there's still more learning to happen in Canada as well, but that's an example I'd like to give to your point.
Reema?
Yes, on human rights, I guess the kind of question is whose human rights and where. And so, I mean, the first thing that kind of struck me when I was posed with this question is that different countries have long-standing human rights frameworks and existing legislative protections that are in play. One of the big challenges and tensions that we've noticed, especially in the UK, is that the legal system is struggling to keep up with the rate of change in AI, and actually that it's not a very effective way of dealing with human rights abusers to rely on a legal system. So that's one really interesting observation. So then the next question is, and how do you do that? And that's about building that recognition of what's going to happen or is likely to happen really front into, I would say, not even just the design and the development process, but also before that, which is this kind of question of who is the technology being designed for, and what is it being intended to do, and is it going to be certainly adversely impacting upon the human rights of individuals involved. And I'm struck by, you know, a long-standing debate actually that happened about contact tracing in relation to Ebola, long before we went into this. So in Ebola, where a lot of people's call data records were accessed by telecoms companies in order to enable contact tracing, and this entire thing was facilitated by a lot of international humanitarian organisations in order to resolve a problem. It was actually not clear that contact tracing was even going to work, and because of the pressures and the climate of that time, you've got a really good example there of a risk of human rights infringements and users. I think that goes back to the kind of fundamentals of making sure that the people to whom the technology relates get to have a say really early on up front in whether this should be even on the table at all as a technology, does it even work? And then secondly, making sure that the process then on is designed in a way that kind of flags up risks of human rights abuses. So example being an impact assessment, or and also processes of external oversight and scrutiny. And that's not about regulation, that's about what happens before the regulation is even engaged.
Okay, thank you. Okay, would the panelists please comment on facial recognition software, which tends to misidentify facial features of minorities? How do you take that into consideration? Niraj, do you want to?
Sure. I think facial recognition is, one of those applications that we can see the AI for good opportunity and also the risks that we're talking about. And so it's a very good example in that way. And as Reema was talking about contact tracing technology, it also has that two sides that we're all sensitive to. So, I think from a policing point of view, from a border security point of view, there's many use cases of facial recognition that can be argued make our society safer and can be supported. But there is risks clearly in this kind of technology. I also, Reema mentioned legislation lagging. It's going to lag everywhere. And so we do have this question about how do we govern, again, the use of these technologies and do it transparently. And so I certainly believe that we would want to understand where's the data going, how's the data being used, how is it trained, to your point about ethnic diversity and minorities, the training data may or may not be appropriate. it for the application. So having good governance practices and measurements around the use would be what I advocate, rather than saying we shouldn't do it. We shouldn't use the technology, because the technology has some very good uses as well. If I could jump to the contact tracing that Reema mentioned, you know, we're in a pandemic right now, and we need to curtail the spread of COVID-19. And so who can argue about the effectiveness of curtailing it with contact tracing technology? But many questions go up rightfully. And so facial recognition, contact tracing, these need to have upfront some guardrails on the application, as opposed to saying we're not going to use these technologies. We need to use it ethically and transparently.
And I just want to pile onto that, not only guardrails, but clear sunsets to these being allowed to be used. We saw this after 9/11 in the Patriot Act, that we gave up a lot of civil liberties in a moment of crisis that became convenient to have for many organizations. And so I think it's a legitimate concern that individuals have for their privacy, and that crisis can often be a moment that is very hard to walk back from. And so I understand that there is a legitimate tension, and I think guardrails and very clear endings to something, to these abilities, even though this pandemic will probably not ever end. We're going to live with this disease. So do these sort of civil liberties we give up never come back to us? We have to really have that public conversation if we want to talk about rights and human rights, again, depending on whose rights I guess you're talking about.
Yeah.
Thank you. Our next question, oh, Reema.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to flag that we published a report on this about a year ago. It's called Beyond Face Value. We call for a pause on the use and application of facial recognition technology, because we didn't think, certainly in the UK, we didn't think that there was really clear guidance on its remit. So actually the boundaries, so its application and its use, and that we felt very strongly that that needed to be worked out quite a bit. And so that report really sets out levels of public confidence in approaches to its use in different scenarios. And so I think there's something really interesting, which is about application of purpose. So, you know, if it's in a live facial recognition technology in a public space, the ethical ramifications around that are so profound, but contrast that to maybe being able to use it to unlock your phone. So, you know, there's two different types of applications there. One of which is incredibly societally problematic from a democratic perspective. The other is, you know, it certainly will raise some challenges, but comparing those two examples gives you an illustration of this point, which is it's about what it's used for rather than what it is. So for me, it's less about the question, does this work, and more about how it's going to be used and what the impacts are going to be on that. But it's worth checking out that report, and we're very proud of it.
Great, thank you. Okay, so another question is, this AI issue can be a bit of a red herring. Isn't it more pertinent to know where the data analysis is based on and where it came from? Who wants to take that on?
I guess I would just jump in and say, I don't really see the difference. And I mean, that is the AI. It's if you can understand the data that went in and how the system came to the recommendation it came to. And I say recommendation because the vast majority of these systems don't actually make decisions. They make recommendations. That is the AI. So I guess I would just say, to me, they're the same. I don't know, Niraj?
Yeah, I think we know that data is the fuel, data is the oil, data is also the plutonium of what could fuel the algorithms in a certain way. So absolutely, data is a huge part of what we need to analyze when we're talking about these upside opportunities as well as the risks as well. I would also say, though, that the model and the algorithm also needs to be analyzed depending on the trust questions and the governance questions. As said earlier, you know, trust is not one size fits all. So the question of explainability, for example, of how did the model make a decision may not be necessarily in the data. It may be in the model or algorithm. So the data is a huge part of it, but the model and algorithm and software is also could be part of what needs to be monitored as well.
Any other comments on that one? Okay. The U.S. Patent Office recently ruled that AI cannot be a legal inventor. Only natural persons can. This is a very interesting question. While we don't give credit to AI for inventions, could we hold it responsible for bad decisions in governance, as opposed to holding the people who design the algorithm?
Well, I mean, I think at least from the perspective that I personally have experienced, we're all hostage to our experience. Most of the folks that I know, we're still very much in the mindset that these systems are providing recommendations, and ultimately a human makes that decision and they're accountable for that decision, which is why trust and trustworthiness and reliability and explainability, again, are so core to what we've been talking about. And I think we've said those words, I don't know, 20 times since we've been on, because they matter. And I actually ultimately believe it's really important to have people take accountability for the decisions that fundamentally get made in their organizations. But maybe the future looks different. I don't think that future is here today.
Any other comments?
I'll just add that, I think there's variations of how the AI, whether it's augmented intelligence, whether it's supporting a decision made by humans, or it's making its own decisions. And I do think we do need to govern machines as well as humans. And, often many organizations are leaning forward and trying to build algorithms and look at their data and figure out the best way to build profitability of their company using AI and technology. I think we have to always put a budget around the governance of that, because as we said earlier, these models may drift. They could continue to learn, and so it's not a go no go like old technology that we say this is ready to go to production and we're ready to roll. No, that's not good enough. We need to keep an eye on it and monitor it over time as well.
Anyone want to add to that?
I'll just pile in on that a little bit. I mean, I think that a really robust conversation that's happening right now in the engineering community is this: what does test and evaluation and verification and validation look like for artificial intelligence? Groups like IEEE have been incredibly active internationally. NIST has been working closely with partners in Europe and across Asia. I think everybody sees that this idea of sort of validation and ongoing certification of these systems is really incredibly powerful. But I don't think that, at least right now in the US, we see anyone leaning towards allowing the AI to be the liable party.
Do you think there's a need for an oversight body, whether through the UN or any other body, and what would that look like?
I can go first. I was thinking as preparing for this webinar that pre-COVID, I wasn't there, but a number of smart people were in Davos looking at a number of important topics. And I believe the CEO of Google, I'm not going to quote him, but said, bring on the legislation. We need more legislation for AI. I think that's a profound comment, but we know not only is legislation lagging, but it's not one size fits all. And I don't think we should wait for legislation. So I would advocate that we do need to consider some common language between countries for the measurement and governance. I know in Canada, the Prime Minister and President Macron of France had a summit with the OECD, the Global Partnership on AI to build responsible AI measures. I know there's other organizations that were mentioned here, and I'm learning from my colleagues the very good initiatives going on, but I do think that we should try to develop as soon as possible some common language on trust and on governance while waiting for legislation, because as we know, we have many different cultures and structures and governments around the world. I don't think we're going to get a uniform set of standards or legislation, but we can have some common language around trust.
Building on that question, what about the sale of AI systems? There's been quite a few examples of a misunderstanding of AI systems and their use in developing countries where the capacity to monitor, you may be familiar with this, where allegedly they got a system of policing for extremely cheap because the company that built it did not have the African faces to for the computer system to learn from. Any thoughts on that? So the question relates to, should these be exported, these such systems?
I think there's just a general challenge, which is around the geopolitics of AI and technology systems. So often systems get developed in one part of the world and then end up, and often in parts of the world where it may be easier to develop that system and then end up in another part of the world with totally different types of cultural norms. And it works both ways. So, we're looking at, thermal imaging cameras that got developed to deal with SARS in China, now increasingly being deployed by Amazon in its warehouses in order to work out whether people have coronavirus or not, or may or not. And I mean, of course, that's a societal, that's a hot potato in and of itself, which is that these technology solutions seem to know no borders. And so then it goes back to the other point, which is it's then incredibly difficult to have a societal debate about their remit and their role. They do seem to be adopted in some instances quite uncritically at times of uncertainty, at times of pressure, without really a clear awareness of where they came from and what's what the cost of the development of that technology solution might have been. So in this instance, there's allegations that it was used in China to discriminate against Uyghur Muslims, for instance. So I think that it's important to recognise that this isn't just about it's not about a system that's used in one part of the world that's been exported elsewhere. It's about a really complex thing, which is the geopolitics of systems, other challenges around aspects of Ada, the biometrics identification system in India. And there's some really interesting reading that argues, you may agree or disagree, it's totally up to you, but argues that it was quite a ripe environment in which to prototype or pilot something that large scale, because the relative vulnerability of many people in India is actually quite easy to get a lot of people who need access to a social safety net onto a data-fied system if you build that in. So no, I think it's incredibly contested territory. I don't think there's any easy answer, but it is important to be, when thinking about the role of technology, be aware of where it came from, where it might have come from, what its track records and its roots are, and what technology solutions it may be seeking to resolve, and whether it actually works in democratic society.
I just want to throw in one little counter to keep in mind, because I agree this is an incredibly complex geopolitical question. This is not an import-export question. And by framing it that way, it's really paternalistic. The United States, will decide what you're competent enough to handle. And that, I think, is deeply inappropriate. I just think it's inappropriate. I think there need to be really good international conversations about transparency of data, of being very clear about what the technology can and cannot do, by making the assumptions and how the sort of governance aspects of that transparent. But I absolutely do not believe it is okay for a group of 8 countries to get together and decide what the other 192 get to have or not have. I think that's a very slippery slope.
Thank you. Okay, we have a few more minutes for some more questions. one question is, when is AI best suited for government-wide uniform rules?
Maybe I can speak to that in the Canadian context. I mentioned earlier that the Treasury Board has a directive that all departments have to use this algorithm impact assessment tool, which is one step above legislation and standards. It's an impact assessment that's transparent. But what we're finding is that each department of the government, though, has its unique elements that are important. So if you're national defense versus the social programs of ESDC versus the revenue agency, there are various use cases that have different governance and trust questions over and above what's standard across the government. So just like human trust, I don't think it's one size fits all, but I do think we need foundational compliance requirements, but we need also flexibility. Our company, NuEnergy AI, has developed a transparent trust index where we can actually allow a measurement to be even specific to a use case, not even a department or a government. So I think you need to have a framework that is both compliance, that's common across all groups, but something that has some variation that could be use case specific.
Yeah, this is a toughie. Could you please repeat the name of the report on AI? Reema? Someone's asking that.
So the one on facial recognition technology.
Yeah, can you repeat it?
Yeah, it's called Beyond Face Value. I'll put a link in the chat actually. That might be the easiest way of dealing with that.
There's a clear narrative that GDPR privacy regulations inhibit AI. Do you think that's correct?
As an entrepreneurial comment, that there's always a trade-off between legislation and innovation, and entrepreneurs and private sector will say, don't hold us back. You're going to stifle innovation if you have regulation. I think we absolutely need regulation, and it's not going to be the same everywhere in the world. But the human rights, the ethics, the good governance is all important to sustaining profitability of a private sector company. So I don't think it's stifling innovation. I think it's moving us in the right direction, even for us entrepreneurs.
Okay. I'm not sure I get this question, but it is, would you address legacy culture as it pertains to AI and government?
I can take a stab. We use the word legacy in the Department of, I don't work for the Department of Defense anymore, but I did for a long time. So I'm sorry, I say we sometimes. I think Department of Defense uses legacy in the sense of like, we have this old system that was pre-AI. We use this a lot with cyber, like lots of weapon systems or just general systems, right? Transportation systems and other things that were not networked. And then we had to retrofit those. So I'm assuming there's like maybe a retrofit to these humans as well. Is there a legacy culture? I can only see it through that lens of like folks who were raised and learned about governance and government and policy pre-AI. And now we have an emerging technology that many people feel is very different. I'm not sure that I totally agree with that. It is certainly an enabler. It's pervasive. I'm not sure that it's that much different ultimately than SynBio or cyber, but many people feel it is, and I can embrace that as a possibility. I think when you're faced with something that you can't imagine the future that you imagine is often frightening. And so actually, I think education helps the legacy culture a lot of like what we can do today with AI is very narrow AI. It's application specific. It's programmed. You can make choices about the data you put in, garbage in, garbage out. You can make choices about the decisions you allow it to make, and that we have free will as humans. And so we should exert that.
Okay, that's such a good point. I want to give everybody 1 minute to make final comments, if you'd like. And I apologize, we couldn't answer all of the questions, but we did get to 9 of them. Niraj, let's start with you.
Thank you, Susan. It's been a delight to be part of this, and I enjoyed the conversation. I'd like to offer to keep it going because we're not able to offer the silver bullets of response, but I do think we want to have a governance framework a common language, NuEnergy AI, our companies, trust questions, and we'd like to collaborate with others and look at this, because I don't think we can wait till one government or one country figures out the model as mentioned, but I do think we can collaborate at a higher plane than legislation and regulation.
Reema?
Yeah, I've really loved the quality of the questions. There's been such and they've been so socially conscious, which is really fantastic actually to see. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've loved the focus on confidence, trust, legitimacy. These are really important questions that we need to answer. I agree with Niraj that I don't think that a single region or nation is going to solve it on their own. I think that we need coordinated efforts. So there's a really important question, which is how do we enable this kind of dialogue and more of this to happen? I'd love to see more of it to happen. So I'm very inspired. Thank you very much.
Melissa?
I agree completely. I would just say I work at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology. We recently put out a report on alliances and really focused on artificial intelligence and what could agile alliances look like in the future. And for me, this is really the takeaway of all of this, is that we don't have to have a one-size-fits-all, but we do need to be working together to make sure that like-minded nations are putting forward R&D that empowers democratic values and good governance, that empowers AI safety and security, that empowers our free will and makes us feel like we are participants in this and not victims of something we can't understand or control. And I agree completely with both of Reema and Niraj that trustworthiness and reliability and the sort of socially conscious discussion that includes ethics very early in the development of this technology is heartening and critical and exciting.
Yeah, but I fear like vaccines, unless people really can get greater education so they can be involved in those discussions, you could end up with an anti-AI movement. But what do I know? Anyway, thank you all so much for participating. We're going to have next week a webinar on gender in the web. And the week after, we're going to look at AI principles, standards, and governance. So comparing different strategies. And then June 18th, we're going to have Denmark's tech ambassador speak to us about why they have an ambassador to Silicon Valley in the United States and to Chinese companies leading the web and new techs. So thank you all so much, and we hope to see you again, and have a great weekend. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.